welcome to episode 76 of A Gamer Looks at 40. I'm Bill, as always, and today we continue our string of one-on-one interviews, kind of this decompress after the Zelda series, and then a recompress into the Final Fantasy series coming later this year. But today's interview is a very different one. This is something that went off the rails in a very delightful way. A few months ago, I chatted with Mike Fallek. Mike is a creator of 100 different things. He has been on podcasts, he's done radio, he's a documentarian, he's working on a game for Trauma, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. So the man does a lot, and he's got a lot of very strong opinions about certain topics. So when I interviewed him back in November of 2022, the intent was to have a conversation about Ocarina of Time. He's a friend of Julian from Nerds Without Pants. Any friend of Julian's a friend of mine. So I'm like, hey, yeah, come on and we'll chat about Zelda, especially Ocarina. What happened was an entire conversation about art history, the nature of criticism, and how Ocarina of Time is emblematic of the struggles of artists trying to create their work in a world where it's constantly being criticized, came out of it. We ended up spending probably 4/5 of the interview not talking about Zelda, talking about anything but the Ocarina of Time topic kept weaving its way in. And if you've listened to this show for any length of time, you know that the idea of the interview is to be broken up into different pieces, but it's very rare when the topic is interwoven the way it was with Mike and I. We disagree on some things, which doesn't usually happen sometimes on this show, because if I'm talking about nostalgia, I can't disagree with your nostalgia. I can't disagree with your memories. But him and I get into it a little bit, and it's not spicy, but I think it's a very interesting and engaging conversation, and one that is not common in my experience. And when I was done with this interview, I kind of looked at it and said, what do I do with this? And there's Ocarina stuff in here, but again, it's too interwoven. So I decided to just leave it as is and plan to publish it now during our series of one-on-one interviews. So I hope you enjoy it. Mike Fallek, again, a fascinating guy. You can check out all of his work at bigweasel.club. Before we get started into the interviews, I'd love to shout out my wonderful patrons who have been sticking with me for some of them since the absolute beginning of the podcast, either in financial terms or just in support. Most of the people on this list have been hanging with me for a while, and I am truly appreciative. They don't have to do this, but they do, and it's very much so appreciated. So let's jump into the thank yous, starting with Games with Coffee, the Let's Play Princess, Tim Knowles of The Elitist, Seth Sergel of the All In Podcast, Ryan Payne of Gamers Week, Greg Sewart of the Player One Podcast and Generation 16 series of videos, Patrice Millette, BT Goebbels, Julian of Nerds Without Pants, Dan of Retrologic, and the always amazing Pete Harney. If you'd like to join these titans of industry, by all means sign up at patreon.com/gamerlooks40. Take a look-see at what we offer there and make a decision today. Let's jump into the conversation with Mike and enjoy it.
Well, so we were talking about something off mic, speaking of which, because normally you ask if I listen to the show, and normally I am the, great watcher on the moon of podcasts. And so I've only listened to a portly 2 episodes of your show. Normally I would have already finished it and been aware of the whole thing. But we were talking about these softwares, these drivers and things with work that, like, for no reason don't work across different platforms with microphones. And it's interesting because you wanted to talk about Ocarina of Time mostly.
Right.
And it's fascinating that and the reason I couldn't listen to all your episodes is because I'm making a game. And so it's taking up a huge amount of my time.
Right on.
And there is a thing with video games where they are still very much in their nascent state. And I find Ocarina of Time to be the most interesting one to talk about nascent states. And so when you talk about drivers and stuff, like, it's only recently that people have realized, like, with a video games, it's like, hey, some of these, maybe that should be a template that we work off of, and that's only happening in recent years. And until then, it was like having to build film acetate for every single film you wanted to make. It was like,
Yeah.
it's insane. And it's crazy that video games are so young that they don't have that yet. But that's effectively, you're asking people to, you're only talking about 30 years ago, where if you were to compare it to painting, the entire video game industry is still the, Mesozoic era human mixing up the correct clays to get different paint colors every single time they make a game.
Sure.
It's pretty bizarre.
Yeah, it's only recently where we actually have tools that you can do these sort of things with. You're 100% right. Reinventing the wheel back in the old days, of course, in the ye olden days. Yeah, everyone was kind of doing their own thing. There was no standardization. Hard to critique, right? Because you have no precedent. It's just, hey, this is fun now. Cool.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, where gaming is, you're right, it's a very, very new thing.
And I don't know if that's what
you,
if you, I don't know your interview technique, because you cut everything up, but like, that's where I wanted to talk about with Ocarina of Time, because it's, and you can stop me if I'm ruining the interview.
No, go for it. This is the whole point, right? Just conversation, let it be natural, and we talk about.
Here's my beef with Ocarina of Time.
Go for it.
It represents everything that is very slow with the nascent state of video game as an art. I think of Ocarina of Time and the current fandom of video games as fandom. There's the average, you're essentially stuck in the 1800s, 1900s with like Gertrude Stein and the era of salons and things like that, and people trying to tell you that what video games are this thing that's in the moment, right? And that's what happens in the height of new art forms. For Gertrude Stein, it was novels, which were not necessarily new, but were becoming their own thing, and poetry, and certainly modern art is growing around the era of Picasso and Gertrude Stein too. And it's this idea that everything is in the moment and everything is what's important. And even your show, the title of it, belies what most people relate to. What was going on then? What was happening then?
Sure.
But when you look at art history, that should be irrelevant. And video games will never advance until we stop talking about them that way, until we stop saying what is in the moment. Video games are obviously the newest art form, unless you want to say, like a lot of early art critics did, that it should be grouped with toys, which I actually don't think that's a problem to group them with toys. I actually think toys in themselves are an art form that are also derided, and perhaps if they had teamed up with video games, they would have done better in the art's eyes of criticism.
Sure.
But instead, they decided to align themselves with movies, and trying to say that this is video art was a big part of it. Multimedia. In other words, the presence of sound and video is what's important. But of course, there's sound and video involved in lots of toys too. And I have so many thoughts. I want to hear what questions you were going to pose to me, just because I'm curious as one interviewer to another. But like, that's where my head is going into this. It's a nascent compared to painting, which is like 5,000 years old, or sculpture, which is, just as old, and all those different things. Film, which is only maybe a couple hundred years old, depending on if you count zoetropes. But video games have decided to put their foot in the ground and say, we're not toys. We're not this thing that's been around forever that maybe is about to get elevated into an art form. We are movies, and we are to be compared to that culture, and we're in the moment. So we don't know right now if that was a good choice, but that's the choice that the industry has made. And Ocarina of Time represents all of that stuff. And if I said art criticism stuff to listeners right now, and you didn't understand why I'm talking this way and why I'm not talking about emotions, it's because welcome to the world of being counted as an art form. This is how you have to talk about it. I'm happy to hear that this has nice memories for you. I'd like to be the museum curator to tell you that's irrelevant. Please take your little badge and walk around quietly. There's no place in art history. I'm sorry, it doesn't.
Well, that's that. I think depending on the context in which you're looking at it, right? I think you're correct. And in art history, art history has to be as objective as humanly possible, right? Because what you're doing is you're critiquing or looking at a work for its inherent values. I do like the fact, and I love the concept of talking about games as an art form. That's honestly is one of my favorite concepts. I may not be as schooled on it.
Oh, don't worry.
But I do think it's very interesting.
What they teach you when you get a BFA is to not necessarily be the most schooled, but look like the most schooled. So I'm just doing a good job at
that.
Yeah.
But that's college. I mean, that's college. That's a fake till you make it thing in college. But I do agree with that. I do also, and I'm going to go back to the kind of I will say the nostalgia piece of the fandom, right? Where I do agree that I think there's nothing wrong with being grouped into toys. I think some of the best games games need to be played. That is the core of what makes a game and what separates it from film and music and paintings. It's play, and play is inherently, that's what toys do. Now, I think it's very interesting how you said the industry said, nope, we're not toys. We don't want to be associated with the toy industry. We're a computer entertainment. Like that's really kind of the niche they slotted themselves into, or the genre they created for themselves.
Multimedia.
But then, multimedia. But when you do that, you now carry the weight of multimedia. So now you have to incorporate that. And personally, I feel like the more games attempt to become cinematic, I think they lose the essence of fun, which is playing a game.
Yeah.
A good example of that is like The Last of Us. Now, I like The Last of Us. I think it's fine. But is it terribly fun to play? I don't know. I don't think so. Right?
Well, let's do some proper art history here as just a term.
Yeah, go for it.
First, totally. Let's free our minds of the word toy. We all think of toy as, because of this move by video games, toy is still derided. But when we look back at toys are the forefront of experimental technology in a lot of ways, because people want to pay for entertainment, but they don't want to have any stakes to making it. So that leads to a large amount of toys which are boring and must wait for the world to advance. But you look at player pianos, automatons, roller coasters, a lot of different things which take one element of technology and then further it in an incredible way. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of games I've seen that are not better than a cheap factory made toy at the dollar store that lights up and makes a laser beam. Right. And if you realize that what video games did was say, instead of toy being a word that you associate with high art, instead of grouping themselves with it and saying, no, now is the time, we take our foot in this, we do some metaphor and expression that says we've had enough, even though I can't think of one, and we say, this is our new thing. The same happened with film. Film could have taken that position. When Méliès and his films came out, they were done as gimmicks. A big part of it was, this wasn't Méliès, but there was a lot of people who would take minimal animation and physically taking the film slide in like a DJ, sliding the celluloid back and forth in order to create minimal animation, playing music along with it. I don't know if people here know about Gertie the dinosaur, but this was a very famous performance where someone would come up on stage and Gertie the dinosaur would do these little motions and they could loop the film, and it was coordinated, like, here, Gertie, here's my cane. And, a cane is just a straight line. So when they handed them the cane, it looked really great, up on stage, this black straight line. Oh my gosh, the dinosaur takes the cane. Film put its foot in the ground and put its line in the sand and put its hat in a bowl of Jell-O, which is an expression I just made up for having enough, and said, no, we're a different thing. And a big part of that was Thomas Edison, who started making newsreels and said, no, this is an extension of journalism and writing. And so then, now what we think about with film is storytelling. So Thomas Edison says this is journalism. People say it's writing. And now we have screenwriters. We take it seriously as a form of storytelling, which of course, inherently, it is not. Film was invented to settle a bet about a horse, which they slam into your head during film school about 98 times. The Muybridge horse. Does like a horse's feet come off the ground? Guess what? It does. And so is born Mickey Mouse. But until then, it's a toy. It's a gimmick. Film decides to take its own course and say, we're a different form of art. The idea that video games don't do that. They don't say, no, now's the time that toys are good and big, and this is the art form you talk about, is really interesting. And so you talk about cinematic qualities of it. The obvious point here that needs to be brought up is which I don't like when people slam on CGI, because of course the only reason we have CGI is because of gamers. Gamers funded LucasArts in the years that they were not known for movies, and they were making video games, which allowed them to create computer technology, which allows them to make CGI in Industrial Light and Magic. That also could have been a turning point where Lucas says, no, this is art. And he doesn't. He says this is a training ground for film almost. They are tied inexorably, film, toy, and video games, and we cannot until another, 500 years really understand what that means. We still don't really understand art forms until everyone's dead. So this is an exercise in futility.
I think that's fair. But I think it's worth exploring, right? Because
it's my job.
It's worth exploring. And fair enough. It's worth exploring, and I think it's worth discussing. And I think as far as again, when you get to the world of criticism, which is why I think in video games, and this is just experiential, what I've experienced, video games tend to have one of the tighter fandoms, because it's almost as if people don't realize you can have some objective measurements to which you can judge a game, whether it's good or bad. And fun is subjective, right? I can play an objectively bad game and still have fun, and still just like I can watch an objectively bad movie and still have fun.
Yes.
Right. So that's, I think, one of those weird things. And going back to play and toys, we're going to talk a little bit about Wind Waker. One of my other guests, when he was talking about this game, said it's like a toy. It plays like a toy. It's fun. It's vibrant. It's exciting. It's alive. And there's nothing. And to your point, there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay. If I give my son, I've had so many situations where I've bought my son some elaborate doohickey that he wanted from the Amazon wish list or whatever. Gave it to him. He plays with it for 5 minutes and he's done. And it just sits there collecting dust. But he'll have he has a foam, like a pool noodle that I created to a sword by wrapping duct tape around the end and said, here's a sword, when he was 3. He still messes around with it, smacking himself, me, his sister. He loves it because it's expressive play. And that's, I think, kind of some of the magic of play. And I don't know why, as gamer people, we've leaned over to the other side. And I still think there's a core there. There's still value just having fun and enjoying the play of a game. But to your point about CGI and the cinematography and games that are very, again, cinematic, there's value in that too.
Ocarina of Time is very cinematic. Ocarina of Time opens with one of the few games in the history of games to be a shot from the perspective of not the first player. It opens with a shot of Navi's perspective, which you never get to see again, using a very cinematic shot that this flying through the air shot, which then later David Yates kind of did some of that stuff in Harry Potter too, definitely inspired by this stuff. This is a very cinematic game, in my opinion. This is one of the big arguments. But if you want to ask why gamers have a lack of ability to understand criticism and fun and all those things, it's Ocarina of Time. It is 100% at fault for all of this stuff, because gamers felt that this was some moment to attach to the idea of this game being really good. And it was a thing that these gamers, these nobody knows what this game is in terms of the creators. The cinematic elements of it are heavy. It's one of the few games I've ever seen that goes into widescreen mode at certain points. We open on a widescreen mode. conveying to any movie watcher, you're going to play a movie. This game doesn't know what it is, and yet gamers have decided they know exactly what the experience is. And that's why I think it's akin to salons. It's something in the moment, a je ne sais quoi, that we don't know. You just have to be there. When in fact, the question is, you can't just say it's a je ne sais quoi, right? You have to answer some of those questions of why you like it. And oftentimes they go back to story. And so is this game being enjoyed for story? Is it being enjoyed for play? The problem is I want to say something about critics, if you'll let me.
Yeah, go for it.
Critics as an artist are bad. And I know a lot of people who do art criticism, and I like that. But let's not forget, we are in, when the elves show up in The Hobbit, and they're like, they're like, you get the feeling like, hey, why don't these jerks like help at all? That's kind of where we're at right now with film criticism and filmmakers. Filmmakers and artists in general are being much nicer to critics in the past few years than we really should be. These are warring factions. The artist says to the world, I am free. I am beautiful. I am whatever I want to be. You don't have to get me, but some lost soul will. And critics say, well, how do I quantify that into something? We are at war with each other, no doubt. So one of the other problems with Ocarina of Time is that war has decided to be blurred. And it represents this thing of gamers who love games being critics of games when, like what you're talking about, that you could just be your own free thinking, free feeling person. There's a term that a professor of mine came up with, which is Lechner's law, which is the story of the movie is the story of its making. Meaning, like Apocalypse Now is all crazy and the shooting was all crazy. But I found there's a reverse effect too, where its place in history also sort of reflects the art. Sometimes you can see, art imitating life is, I guess, the other expression that works with that. You sort of are the young boy who has no voice when you were free and you were having fun, but at the same time, gamers seem to feel like they had no agency. And there's good and bad to this stuff. So the boy with no voice is laughed off and uncared about. So he gets himself a voice. And now he has the ability to criticize and say things and change the world and how it's going to be shaped. But at the same time, he is envied, this small boy, whenever he goes anywhere in the world as, wow, you were once a free, isolated, and protected person in the woods, free of all this agency and things like that. And that's like a big part of Ocarina of Time for me, that, it was this moment of saying, we're going to have a voice in this stuff. And being a fan means being a critic, and loving it means understanding it, as opposed to allowing critics to be their own little horrible selves and write whatever they want, and fans being their own thing, which are full of joy and erratic love. Instead, video game art connoisseurs, which is what you are, you're engaging in the culture, is now stamped permanently with criticism. Again, another choice that no one ever made before, and we won't know what that choice looks like for a very long time. Whether you've screwed yourself essentially by associating yourself with critics who are inherently the enemy of artists. And so I think this game is also to blame when you see this pushback against video game fans and large video game creators, because artists inherently hate critics. We like fans.
And here's my pushback, and we may now not talk about Zelda and just talk about this, which is perfectly fine with me. I don't know if I agree with that, and I don't think that has to be the case. I think the nature of criticism, I like criticism. I wrote film reviews for many, many, many years for small sites here than everywhere. Mm-hmm. Nothing I got paid for. I really appreciate and enjoy criticism. And the reason why is that I think artists are so, and again, as someone who creates things, can be extremely attached to what they make because they're so personally invested. And it's very hard to tell someone that a work that they've put together has fallen short in some way, shape, or form. I think, though, good critique can help inform art.
Mm-hmm.
Good critique can say to an artist, hey, if it's done with kindness, if it's done with respect for what the work they put in. The problem with modern critique is that there's no respect. So that's why I think artists feel attacked. Whenever I wrote a film review, I made a point. First off, the hardest review to write is one of a movie that you didn't like. It's extremely hard because I don't want to be the asshole who says, well, this thing stunk. It's easy to write something sensationalist. I always try to write something from a perspective that the artist not only would be reading that review, but they'd be sitting in front of me reading it, like literally sitting in front of me.
As a critic would think, which is that you're the star of the show, even though the art is.
Not so much the star of the show. No, not the star of the show. Not the star of the show. I'm trying to be empathetic towards the person who made this thing.
Yeah.
Right? Because a human being worked really hard. 30, 100, 300 human beings worked really hard on this thing. And based off of a set of rules that are subjective to me, but these are the things that I value as a human being and as a critic, because every critic's going to be different, right? They have different value sets, different rule sets. Based off of this belief system, I feel it fell short at XYZ. And when I write this review, I want to express my opinion, inform my readers of what I believe about this, and hopefully help maybe inform them if they want to see it or not see it. And if they do or don't, that's perfectly fine. But I think critique can inform art and can help actually elevate it. But again, the problem is that we don't do this kindly anymore. And everybody's, and this is the difference between, again, opinion, belief, and conviction. We take everything way too seriously. All of our opinions are now beliefs, and all our beliefs are convictions, which is why you lose friends based off of what Star Wars movie you like. Yeah, I mean, or a Hobby Lobby, sign. That would be good. I think that would be helpful. But I don't know. I think I'd push back a little bit.
I like the
on
pushback.
The thing.
And let me phrase it in another way too. That brings up why Ocarina of Time is a very interesting and problematic piece of art history. We now have your podcast, right? And it all goes back to Toy and Thomas Edison and journalism. It all goes back to that. And we are living in the shadow of Thomas Edison's prediction that everyone will have literally described an iPad. And until recently, Thomas Edison was thought to be an idiot in the world of film and art criticism, because Thomas Edison said the theater will die. We'll all carry these pieces of media around with us, and there'll be so much film and video everywhere. You won't care. Why should I invest in a large building when I can ship something from place to place? And when people aren't interested, they can get rid of it, and I can put a Nickelodeon somewhere else that people can listen to. And it's only been recently, as recent as when I went to film school, where people would teach that, and I go, he's right. And, there's a teacher teaching this stuff, and the whole classroom has to, go, you're wrong. We're all holding devices we're all watching stuff. We all have TVs in our home. He's right. Yeah. You have to change the books. Right. And so it all goes back to this problematic part of you're creating this, right? We've blurred the line between media and things like that. And there's lots of people that view art history in this same way, which is to say that a lot of the things we consider art would have been considered historical documents like portraits and things like that. And then we go back and say, wow, how profound, but in fact, it's not. But I want to kind of shift away from that, which is always to say, like, are you an artist by making this piece of media? Of course, you're using many skills of the craft and you're creating a great show. It's undebatable. Are some, is the Roger and Ebert TV show, is that a piece of art? Yeah. So can we criticize it as a piece of film? Sure. And so there's the snake eating its own tail that is going to get more and more complicated. But
sure, that's interesting.
Whether it's done kindly or not has nothing to do. That's an interesting idea and perspective. And I think that's probably the self-consciousness in us, right? That says, oh, people don't like me. But artists really don't care if people like them. They're usually on a mission. The worst ones have no ability to navigate in the world and hear like, oh, I'm being pigheaded and I'm not going to get this grant or whatever it is. But
Right.
the more apt analogy to understand why this is a problem for them to be mixed together is what you're saying is interesting, and it's the modern world we live in. And again, I'm going to use the metaphor here of the fairy folk isolated and protected by the great Deku tree.
Sure.
What you're saying is, listen, I write a home goods magazine, and there's good ways to clean a home and there's bad ways to clean a home. And I know how to do this better, and I can buy products and give them an idea. And what the artist will view you as instead is a Zen monk cleaning a traditional temple with 1,000-year-old techniques, and you're trying to hand them a Swiffer wet jet. It has nothing to do with good or bad, or liking or not liking, or vicious or not vicious. Artists strive to be the hidden fairy folk. Artists strive to be this free thing that is unhindered by anything. And again, the metaphor is apt. The boy who finds a voice. What implications does this have in the world? And the implication is at this point that I can't fight it. I'm not so stupid that I think I'm going to say this and people are going to go, well, why am I talking like a critic? You must, because that's how people talk about video games now, is they talk as if they are video game critics. Video game criticism, I don't want people to think, was building a crazy amount around that era too. Like it was, the magazines, that's the height of that stuff. And so what you then end up having is star fans, essentially. You have people that we admire are so good at doing this stuff that now you don't want to be a game creator. Less video gamers want to be a game creator than video gamers want to be game critics, which is a very interesting, and again, I'm not so smart that I know the answer, but it's like you said, objective. It's a third person perspective looking at other art forms and going, wow, this game represents two really interesting turns in the world of fandom, which is to say fan and critic, which are normally on the other ends of the spectrum. The critic probably represents someone like the castle and chic and all those different, the practical people.
Sure.
And the fairy folk are represented by the fans. They will no longer be separate or a spectrum. They are linked as one. A link, perhaps, to the past. No, different game. But the point is that now they are one. It is an absolute choice. The fairy folk are a part of this world and are now joined as one peoples. And so how that's going to end up being, having star critics who are normally reviled. Normally what it is you have fans, and the fans say, to hell with the critics. And the artist and the fan are a team against the critic who is trying to bring to the person who doesn't get it, have them avoid quote unquote bad artists and have them join in and understand quote unquote good artists. But video games have chosen that there is no fan anymore. Nobody says I'm a video game fan. Nobody says that whatever. They are all one. And so it's a really weird time to be looking back on this, but at the same time, I think it's really interesting. Like the stuff you're doing is stuff that like will inform the future about what was going on in people's heads about this stuff.
Right. And that's what and that's why this show does kind of trade in nostalgia. Now I will state, pretty clearly, and I don't think I've ever stated this on this show before in 50 something episodes, but I think nostalgia can be very dangerous. I think nostalgia can be addictive. I think nostalgia can cloud you of the present. I think it's very easy to live in the past if your future doesn't seem so bright when you face your own mortality. However, I do think there's a lot of value.
Put that one on.
Yeah,
put that one on something. You're just racking them up.
I should work for Hobby Lobby. That might be my next
deeply
gig.
Homophobic? Like, do you know about how Hobby Lobby is literally the Nazis
I know.
from? Do you know they steal religious artifacts?
I did not know they steal religious
They're literally
artifacts,
the
but I know
Nazis
it's pretty
from
horrifying
Indiana
stuff.
Jones. They got caught.
I live in Texas. They're all over the place. That's my first home goods reference. So I apologize if that's
No, it's okay.
if that led you anywhere.
Listen, as a Jew, I told people when it's like shopping at Hobby Lobby, I go, listen, everyone's anti-Semitic. I can't really pick and choose who hates and doesn't like Jews. So, but they are literally the Nazis from Indiana Jones. They've been busted several times for stealing religious artifacts.
I did not know that. I'll be perfectly. I had no idea. That's bonkers.
It's insane.
That's absolutely bonkers.
The face of this, face of the modern Indiana Jones Nazi is like the tchotchkes that you buy.
That's so funny.
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine. Religious posters and frog statuettes, and I don't know what else, and walls of ornaments for Christmas. So, anyway, I kind of lost
nostalgia
my
is
a little
dangerous.
Bit. Nostalgia. So nostalgia can be very dangerous. But I also think it can be an enjoyable pastime. And what this show is trying to do is exactly what you just said. Try to capture what people felt back in the day, we'll just say, before everything was recorded instantaneously on Twitter and every place else. Because right now we are constantly recording and capturing our lives as we move forward in a variety of different ways, a variety of different mediums. That wasn't the case 30 years ago.
But at the same time,
yeah,
you reach this impasse with fun where, take a date, for instance. Let's say you go on an okay date. If someone were to come into an okay date and say, hey, you're going to die in like a couple decades, right? It would ruin the okay date. And
I just think it would, yes.
And what you have with fun, aside from memento mori, is you have what is called in the world of gaming the magic circle. Has anyone talked about it on the show yet?
No, I don't think so. No,
so
it hasn't.
The magic circle is the idea of what is the difference between war games. A lot of the early stuff written about gaming was about war simulation. And someone said, well, to what extent are we training ourselves for war? And to what extent are we playing? And someone invented the term, which I should probably know, called the magic circle. Because I've been building myself up to make video games, I have an absolute addiction to not looking stupid. So I have been playing games. I had a problem for years where I couldn't play games out of order. I tried to play historically, starting with Atari and moving my way up. I've only recently given myself permission. The magic circle states that what separates play and why children often engage in play more is you are protected by a ring that is often represented by a physical ring, a line in the sand, as magic as that, if you want to go back to, symbols and hieroglyphs and stuff like that, that says this line has rules that you will not leave this line dead. And it's really important. And it's one of the reasons why play is important outside of games. Because, listen, if I made a baseball field and right in the middle of the baseball field, which they do this now, which is crazy, but if right in the middle of the baseball field it said tax season is coming, you wouldn't enjoy baseball. If the rules of baseball said to have right in the middle, you probably have a cavity building right now in your teeth. I can't change the rules of baseball. You have to right in the middle of the field. You have a cavity forming in your teeth. You'd never be able to get over it. This is what we create with play is we try to make a safe zone where you can't get out of it. And so you reach that with nostalgia, right? You reach this with fandom. And you're seeing it. I'm doing a documentary now where a big part of it is these people that have horrible fans in comedy. And they inspire all this hate. And the reason it happens is it's very hard to be the party pooper and to say, this isn't how you should be doing it. So I can't come on here and go, you're being critics. Critics is a thing that artists hate. We don't like it. We don't like if it's nice. We don't want to talk to you. We don't care about your opinions. We're little fairy folk living in the woods and we don't need to talk to you. Instead, you can't do that. Because that's going to ruin the fun. So if people are having fun, you can't then take that down a peg and say you shouldn't be having nostalgia because you're poisoning your own water well. And so there is also there's these supposed to be demarcated lines in the sand where there's an artist line, fan line, critic line, and instead what you have is a merging of all three. when you look at the mod culture too, how dare you touch my art would be the response 30 years ago. Now it's welcomed. We are constantly in video games changing this line, which is so well defined. And like you said, I'll have my Dexter moment here. I don't know that nostalgia is an emotion everyone feels. I think it should be really studied psychologically. I don't feel it. I genuinely don't.
Interesting. That's fair.
And so there's a chance that perhaps I am a sociopath, and the bodies that talk to me in my basement haven't said so yet. But I think I might be imagining that they talk to me, so I don't want to take their criticisms seriously.
Yeah, but it's interesting you mentioned that about nostalgia, because as somebody who does a podcast that one would think again trades in nostalgia, I'm not terribly nostalgic either. It's actually only an emotion I really felt over the last couple of years, kind of turning 40, milestone, looking back a little bit, and then realizing a lot of the moments of my life that were important, or I'll say important, graduating college didn't, which wasn't that important anyway, but let's kind of let's throw that aside. I'm not terribly nostalgic, but for me, the stories, I'm here for stories. So I want to hear people's stories of how they experience, but I also love this conversation. Yeah. So trust me, all this is very good for me, because this is a side I don't get from a lot of these conversations.
Let me tell you another story that you point out my purpose completely is one of the, when you're an artist studying story, which is called narrative versus nonfiction in the world of film. You learn about the Bible quite a bit. And what you're describing is the Moses paradox. I'm creating this game for Trauma Entertainment based on the game Poultrygeist. And so it's a very much story-based game. It's very much like Tales, not like the Tales of games, the Telltale games, excuse me. It's a story-based game. It's, that kind of game like you're talking about earlier, because that's the story that I want to tell. But you talk about the idea of you don't necessarily feel nostalgic, but you are now creating something which is talking about nostalgia. You're experiencing the Moses paradox. And I want to bring it back to what you said earlier about documenting things and true documentation. So for this game for Trauma, I interviewed Gary Dumm, who was an illustrator for Harvey Pekar. I don't know if you know him, but okay. Mm-hmm. So I'll let you do that cool NPR thing where you tell people who Harvey Pekar is. Harvey Pekar was
you know me too well.
I've got you pegged. So
you do.
When you talk about documentation, Harvey Pekar, what we're documenting is not really honesty. We don't document everything. We don't say, so I had gas the week I played this game, and so I didn't really like sitting there. I wanted to sit on the toilet. It took too long to come back. We don't actually document in the way that Harvey Pekar did. And I interviewed Gary, who lives in Cleveland, along with me, to be a thing you can find in the game. Essentially, you can listen to a podcast while you play the game and explore. And that podcast is a real podcast I created, an episode of which where I interview this legendary artist who let me come into his home and talk to him. It was so much fun. But we don't document things honestly. And one of the things that Gary said was, and he said all artists relate to this. He said, I describe art as you go somewhere when you make art, and what you come back with is a souvenir. And that's what you come back with. And so what you're experiencing, and that goes back to the Moses paradox. Moses must lead the people into the promised land, but Moses is not allowed to enter himself. You're experiencing exactly what we do. You're taking the trip that Gary has said for you. You're trying to describe nostalgia. You're trying to quantify it in an artistic way. You're trying to experience it in a way that can be told to people, that can be shown to people. You yourself can't enter the promised land. You can never. And that's the same as it goes for artists. The artist can never be a fan of their own work. And so the fan is thought to never be able to be a critic of the thing itself. And this is why video game fandom is so confused. You have no models to base yourself after. How can you be a fan and a critic at the same time? You're not supposed to be able to enter the promised land. And so the artists have contextualized this brilliantly, which is to say, I can't enter the promised land. I will guide these people there no matter who they are, which is still the Moses paradox. Moses did not particularly like the slaves. He felt his people were, ruined and broken. Annoying. He found
annoying. Extremely annoying.
He planned to kill them off. So he wanted the new generation to rise and succeed where the older people could not. He believed in that. And so we contextualize, we'll just appeal to everybody. This is a new version of this. I can't enter this world anyway. I can't be a film critic. Or can I? How common is the idea of the artist who then has a podcast or a Twitch page where they play games or watch video games? We're entering a new realm. And what you're talking about earlier fits in great. These objective things versus subjective things. If you want to have the most objective experience, you go and separate yourself. You go to that world and you separate yourself and you bring back a souvenir that will guide someone who can enter that world, but you can't. But now you're mixing those things. You're saying, I am both being nostalgic, but exploring nostalgia in the case of you. I am both criticizing video games and being a fan of them. I'm both making them and making a piece of art that is fandom. There is no guidance for what we have. And that's why the video game world it's very easy to see from an outside perspective. There's no objectiveness because no one will demarcate that line and say, I'm not a fan, right. I'm a critic. I'm not a critic, I'm a fan. I don't have to explain it to you. I like it. I'm done. I like it. Yeah, but a food critic, for example, says your mom's cookies are chalky. No, they're not. They're my mom's cookies, you jerk.
Right.
You're a fan.
And that's, I think, and that's interesting because I think and I will state this, and it may sound really corny and heady, but there is a craft to critique as well, where I think it's almost like critique is like a job, mm-hmm. right? Like I like to say, I used to write a lot of, I used to write for a local blog here in Austin where we talked about hyper-local things to do, see, eat, drink, etc., right? Things to do, kind of lifestyle sort of thing. And the mission of the blog was we only wrote about stuff we liked.
Cool.
We didn't write negative articles because we had a pretty good reach, and we still do. And if we wrote something negative about a small business and the right people see that, that business could close.
Right.
So we've had situations where we would go someplace, and rather than write an article, I would say to the person, hey, you know what? I had a rough experience. I'd like to pay for my meal in advance because you paid for this. But I'm just not going to write anything. But here are some things I just noticed to the owner. Mm-hmm. And this website has now turned into I'm going to be honest, a terrible listicle. Everything's at top 10, top 5, top 8. And I've said, to people like, I said to the owner, I'm like, I just don't want to write for the site anymore. I'm just not going to write for it. And the comments I heard was, well, don't you read top 10 articles, top 8, top 5? I go, sure I do, but I don't want to make what I read. I just because I eat sushi does not mean I want to be a sushi chef. Mm-hmm. I don't want to create that. I'll read it, sure, I'll engage in it, fine, but that's not something I'm terribly interested in. So I think that might tie in a little bit with what you're saying.
It absolutely does.
I do think, though, and I think the hard part is for people is I think the two sides can exist, but it's really hard. And I actually would love to see a review of a game where the critic is giving his opinions and at the very end says, but you know what? I still had a good time with this. I don't know why. And kind of throw in the air, but you never will see that because a critique cannot have that or should not have that kind of subjectiveness where a fan is 100% subjective and rightfully so.
And this is
right. I tell people all the time on the show and other places, play the 6 out of 10s, play the 7 out of 10s. If you read it or see a clip of it and it looks interesting and it's $4 on Steam, buy it. Why not? You may find some joy in that. You won't have to go by review scores, but it can also inform. So it's a really hard balance, which I think is what you're trying to say.
And I'll do my NPR, even though we're not done maybe yet, but I'll do my NPR kind of thing here. And so what you've hit on, wait, hold on, let me do it. I'm going to be serious. And so
I got you.
So what you've hit on there is again, the story of Ocarina of Time. And what you've realized is that once Link leaves this village, which was not so great, but was protected and isolated, Link can never return. And so too have the players entered a journey where they cannot return to the way games were or the way they talked about games. You are forever stuck because you had that time there and now it's gone. The age of innocence is over. And just like Link, it was not a great age of innocence. You were voiceless and teased and treated like an idiot. But instead, now you have a voice. And so you'll never go back to that other part where it's only pure bliss and consideration. We now are in an era where you want to say, maybe it's really hard to do this. But the reality is, just like Ocarina of Time, and I'm sure you're going to have lots of people talk about how frustrated they are with it, it's now easier. It may be very easy. It may be very simple to do. You just don't know how, like any good game. Wow, so profound. Oh my gosh. So profound.
Extremely.
Insanely profound.
What a bow. What a bow. I don't have a hard stop. I want to make sure we kind of land the plane a bit. Before we do though, I would love to hear about the game you're making, some of the projects you've been working on. You've mentioned quite a bit, right? Yeah. Radio and podcasts and documentaries and everything else. I'd love to hear about all of that so our listeners can check it out and check out some good work.
I'm making a game right now for Troma based on the cult classic Poultrygeist, about a haunted chicken. And our game is going to take a very hard environmental stance against lawn mowing and leaf blowing, one of the environmental scourges of the current world. Absolute insanity that this is still happening. Using a gas-powered lawnmower is the pollution equivalent of driving a car for 8 hours. If you use a gas mower for 1 hour, that's like driving a car for 8. It's horrible. So Troma has always been about environmentalism, humor, and other stuff. But it's going to be a really funny, scary, cool game about the world of environmentalism and suburban chickens versus the world of mowing a lawn and killing the planet. That's all I'm working on.
Let me cut in real quick and state that my sister is high-fiving the air at this point. She's a zookeeper and an environmentalist as well, and she has told me numerous times that every time you mow your lawn, you're destroying an ecosystem. Yep. Like, she's like, you do realize that creatures live there and rely on that just to make your lawn pretty, like it was in the 70s. And I'm like, yeah, tell that to my HOA. Yeah. All right. Maybe because they're unfortunately the ones who kind of dictate that. So it's so interesting that you're doing that, because you are 1,000% right about everything you stated. So I think that's going to be a really fun concept. Yeah.
And it's going to be Troma-y and fun and crazy looking. And I have so many amazing writers and people acting and working on it with me, and it should be out on all platforms. So maybe you'll
when are you expecting it to be out?
I expect it to be out in 2023 is all we're saying right now. So that's all we're saying. But not like December. Fantastic. Guys. Okay, later than that.
Yeah.
But I do a radio show. I have a podcast. I do all that stuff. You can search me, Mike Fallek, Fallek. But I'm sure people will find it. I have a thing where I'll tell you something about it, to sum up this whole thing. I hate doing plugs. I do it now because I want you to know the info, and I want your people to know the info. But I have this thing, if this is not meta enough, where it's like, you know what? They paid for the show, metaphorically. If it's not funny, I won't do it. And a friend of ours, Julian Titus, will often slam my hand on the grill and tell me to do it anyway. But it's a whole thing of wanting to make fun for people. That's my whole thing. Is you should be in it. No one should take you out of it. It's like, here's one. Here's a new one. When an app asks you to review it while you're using it, go away. Let me live my life. It's ridiculous. Here's one I saw. Google. Like, I was using Google Gmail or something. And they're like, would you like to review us? It's like, hey, Google, I think you're fine without some more 5-star review. I think Google will do fine without more reviews in the Apple Store.
Thanks again to Mike for spending his time with me and having this, again, kind of wild, fun, rambling, and really interesting interview. Again, this is not the sort of thing I get often, so thanks again to Mike for joining me on the show. If you want to check out more of his work, once again, Big Weasel, lilweasel.club online. All of his everything exists on that site. Thank you for listening to the show. Do the podcast things everybody asks of you. You know what it is by now. Discord and Twitter and social media and all the other things. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thanks again for checking out the show, and until next time, be kind to yourselves and each other.